The car tumbled down the ravine at precisely 11:47 p.m. on a rainy October night. By the time emergency services arrived, flames had already consumed most of the vehicle. They found no body inside, just a briefcase with Professor Thomas Harlow's identification, a half-burned photograph of his wife and his wedding ring carefully placed on the dashboard. The authorities searched for 3 days before declaring it a tragic accident, presuming his body had been thrown from the vehicle and carried away by the raging river below. For Sarah Harlow, that rainy night marked the beginning of 6 years of grief, questions, and a void that grew deeper with each passing day. She would never have imagined that an accidental tap on her phone screen would shatter everything she believed about her husband's death. Sarah still remembered how they met at the university library 15 years earlier. Thomas, with his tweed jacket and wire-rimmed glasses, had been the youngest professor in the literature department, his lectures always filled to capacity with eager students captivated by his passionate analyses of classic tragedies. Life's most profound secrets, he would tell his students, are hidden in plain sight within great literature. You just need to know how to read between the lines. Those words would haunt Sarah years later, when she discovered how masterfully Thomas had crafted his own disappearance. Their romance had blossomed quickly. Coffee meetings to discuss books became dinners discussing life, and within a year they were married in a small ceremony in the university gardens. The photograph from that day stood on Sarah's nightstand throughout their marriage, Thomas looking at her with what she had always interpreted as profound love. 6 years after his disappearance, that same photograph still remained, though the glass had cracked when she'd thrown it against the wall during one particularly dark night of grief. The first year after Thomas's death had been a blur of funeral arrangements without a body, condolence cards and administration. The university had held a memorial service where colleagues spoke of his brilliant mind and gentle spirit. He had so much more to give, the department chair had said, his voice breaking. Sarah had nodded mechanically, clutching the folded flag they had presented her with, though Thomas had never served in any military. It seemed people needed these rituals even when they made little sense. At night, alone in their colonial-style home filled with thousands of books Thomas had meticulously collected, Sarah would wake to phantom sounds: his key in the door, his footsteps on the stairs, the creak of his office chair. "It's just grief," her therapist explained. "Your mind is trying to maintain connection." But something about these moments felt different, as if the house itself was trying to tell her something she couldn't yet understand. By the second year, Sarah had returned to teaching high school English, functioning on autopilot. Her colleagues gave her space, no longer asking how she was doing. They wouldn't understand anyway. How could they? How do you explain that grief doesn't move in a straight line toward healing, but circles back on itself, surprising you with its intensity when you least expect it? It was during this second year that Sarah first noticed something unusual. Thomas's office at home, which she had left untouched, felt different somehow. Books slightly rearranged, papers moved an inch to the left. At first she attributed it to her own absent-mindedness, or perhaps the cleaning service. But then she found a leather bookmark between the pages of The Odyssey, Thomas's favorite, that she didn't recognize. It wasn't there before, she was certain. Or was her mind playing tricks on her? By the 3rd anniversary of Thomas's death, Sarah had joined a support group for those who had lost spouses in tragic circumstances. Most members spoke of closure, of moving forward, of honoring their loved ones by living fully. Sarah nodded along, but couldn't share the nagging feeling that something about Thomas's death didn't add up. The police report detailed a straightforward accident: wet roads, a sharp curve, no guardrail. Yet no mechanical failure had been identified in the burned wreckage, and Thomas had been an exceptionally careful driver who knew that road well. Sometimes, the group facilitator had said gently when Sarah finally voiced her doubts, "We create mysteries because accepting the randomness of tragedy is too difficult." The others nodded sympathetically, and Sarah never mentioned her suspicions again. But privately, she began to collect inconsistencies. The fact that Thomas had taken out additional life insurance just 3 months before the accident, the email she found when going through his old accounts about a conference in Buenos Aires he had never mentioned attending, the strange call from a bank in Switzerland asking about an account she knew nothing about. In year 4, Sarah placed all these fragments in a box, which she stored high on a shelf in the guest bedroom closet. She was trying to move on. She went on a date with a history teacher from her school, a kind man with gentle eyes who talked about his passion for Civil War battlefields. She couldn't bring herself to see him again, though she couldn't exactly articulate why. It wasn't loyalty to Thomas's memory that held her back, but something else, something unresolved that prevented her from turning the page. That same year, Sarah's mother suffered a stroke, and the following months were consumed with her care. During this time, Sarah rarely thought about the inconsistencies surrounding Thomas's death. Her energy was focused on rehabilitation exercises, doctor's appointments, and adapting her mother's home for wheelchair accessibility. The mystery of Thomas receded into the background, a luxury she could no longer afford to dwell on. By year 5, Sarah's mother had regained enough independence for Sarah to return to her own home and her full teaching schedule. The 5-year milestone hit her hard. 5 years of being a widow, of living alone, of wondering. On the anniversary, she opened a bottle of Thomas's favorite scotch and allowed herself to look at old photographs. There was Thomas in front of the Eiffel Tower during their honeymoon, Thomas building bookshelves for their first apartment, Thomas asleep on the couch with a book open on his chest. His life, their life, captured in these frozen moments. As midnight approached, Sarah found herself drawn to the box of inconsistencies she had put away. She pulled it down from the shelf and spread its contents across the guest bed. In the amber light of the bedside lamp, the fragments seemed to connect differently than before. The insurance policy, the conference in Argentina, the Swiss bank account, and something new, a realization that Thomas's most treasured books, first editions of classic works he'd spent years collecting, were not among the volumes in his office. Had she simply not noticed their absence before? Or had they disappeared at some point after his death? Sarah's head throbbed with questions and whiskey as she finally fell asleep that night, the pieces of the puzzle scattered around her. She dreamed of Thomas, standing at the edge of the ravine where his car had gone over, looking down not in fear, but with a strange determination. In the dream, he turned to look at her before stepping deliberately into the darkness. The 6th year brought a new principal to Sarah's school, and with him, a push toward technology integration. Teachers were encouraged to use social media to connect with alumni and showcase student achievements. Reluctantly, Sarah created professional accounts on various platforms. She rarely used them for personal browsing, finding most social media either depressingly superficial or uncomfortably intrusive. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon in April. Sarah was in her classroom after school, absent-mindedly scrolling through Instagram while her students' essays, uploaded to the school's digital grading platform. Her thumb slipped, accidentally tapping on a suggested account, someone she didn't follow. The profile belonged to a bookstore in Santiago, Chile, a small independent shop specializing in rare first editions and literary classics. The most recent post showed a collection of newly acquired Hemingway first editions. Sarah was about to navigate away when something in the background of the image caught her eye. A partial face, slightly blurred but visible behind the bookshelf. She enlarged the image, her hands shaking so badly she had to place the phone on her desk. There in the background, caught in profile and partially obscured, was a man who looked unmistakably like Thomas. Older, with a beard now, but the distinctive slope of his nose, the set of his jaw. Sarah would recognize them anywhere. Her heart raced as she quickly scrolled through the bookstore's other photos. There, in an image from 3 months earlier, the same man, more clearly visible this time, examining a book while standing near the register. And again, in a group photo captioned "Literary Night with Professor Juan Navarro." Thomas standing at the edge of the group, his face half turned away from the camera as if deliberately avoiding full exposure. Sarah sat motionless in her empty classroom as the final bell rang in the distance. The essays had finished uploading, but she barely noticed the completion notification. Her mind raced through possibilities, a doppelganger, a cruel coincidence, or the unthinkable, that Thomas had staged his own death and built a new life halfway across the world. It was too much to process alone. With trembling fingers, Sarah took screenshots of the images and sent them to Emily, her closest friend and the only person who had never suggested she should move on from Thomas's death. The message was simple. Is this Thomas, or am I losing my mind? Emily's response came within minutes. Holy shit, that's him, that's definitely him. That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. She paced her house, moving from room to room as if searching for something, though she wasn't sure what. In Thomas's office, she ran her fingers along the spines of his remaining books. wondering which ones he had deemed worthy of taking to his new life, and which he had been willing to leave behind, like her. By morning, Sarah had made a decision. She called in sick to work, something she rarely did, and booked a flight to Santiago for the following day. Emily tried to talk her out of it. What if it's not him? What if it is? Are you prepared for either outcome? But Sarah was resolute. 6 years of questions deserved answers. The flight to Chile was long, giving Sarah too much time to think. She alternated between absolute certainty that she had seen Thomas and crushing doubt that she was chasing ghosts. She rehearsed confrontations in her mind, imagining the moment she would stand face to face with the husband she had mourned for 6 years. What would she say? What could he possibly say in return? Sarah arrived in Santiago exhausted, but too wired to rest. She checked into her hotel, showered, and changed clothes before seeking out the bookstore she had seen on Instagram. La Biblioteca Secreta, the secret library, was tucked away on a narrow street in a historic district. From across the street, Sarah studied the storefront. It was charming, with blue-painted trim and windows displaying leather-bound volumes. A bell chimed as she finally worked up the courage to enter. The interior was exactly as it had appeared in the photos. Warm wood shelves reaching to the ceiling, a small reading area with worn leather chairs, the scent of old books and coffee. A young woman greeted her in Spanish from behind the counter. Sarah responded in halting phrases from a translation app on her phone, asking if Professor Navarro was available. The clerk's expression changed subtly before she replied that the professor wasn't in today, but would be hosting a reading the following evening if Sarah would like to attend. Sarah thanked her and browsed the store, pretending interest in the books while studying every detail of the space. Near the register was a bulletin board with flyers and business cards. Among them was an announcement for the reading, featuring a small photo of Professor Juan Navarro, literature specialist and rare book authenticator. The image was deliberately scholarly, showing the subject in profile with attention focused on a book rather than the camera. But there was no doubt in Sarah's mind. Juan Navarro was Thomas Harlow. That evening, Sarah sat in her hotel room researching Juan Navarro. He had apparently appeared in Santiago literary circles about 5 years ago, quickly establishing himself as an expert in American and British literature. There were a few articles quoting him on recent acquisitions or authentications, and a mention of a lecture series he had given at the University of Santiago. His background before Chile was vague, something about teaching in Argentina and Spain. No photos showed him clearly. He seemed to have a talent for being present yet somehow invisible. Sarah barely slept that night. By morning, she had formed a plan. Rather than attending the reading and confronting Thomas publicly, she found the address of his apartment, listed on a university faculty directory. It was in a modest but nice neighborhood about 20 minutes from the bookstore. The building was older but well-maintained, with a small courtyard visible through wrought-iron gates. Sarah positioned herself on a bench across the street, her heart racing every time someone entered or exited. Hours passed. She was about to give up when she saw him. Thomas, Juan, emerged from the building wearing clothes Sarah had never seen, carrying a leather messenger bag that wasn't familiar either. But his walk, the way he adjusted his glasses as he consulted his phone, the slight tilt of his head, these were all achingly familiar. He was thinner than she remembered, his hair now salt and pepper rather than the dark brown it had been. The beard was new, but it was him, undeniably him. Sarah's carefully rehearsed confrontation dissolved as she watched him cross the street and head down the block. Instead of calling out, she followed at a distance. He walked several blocks before entering a cafe where he was greeted warmly by the staff. He took a seat by the window and opened his laptop. Sarah watched from outside as he sipped espresso and typed, completely unaware of her presence. This was the moment. Sarah could walk in, stand before him, demand explanations. Instead, she found herself frozen, studying this stranger who wore her husband's face. He looked happy, relaxed. There was none of the tension she remembered seeing in him during their final year together. Just as Sarah finally gathered the courage to enter the cafe, a woman approached Thomas's table. She was elegant, perhaps in her early 40s, with dark hair pulled back in a simple style. Thomas, Juan, looked up and smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes. He stood to greet her with a kiss on both cheeks. They spoke animatedly as she joined him, their easy familiarity evident even from a distance. Sarah retreated, her legs barely supporting her as she stumbled back to her hotel. It was one thing to discover your dead husband was alive. It was another entirely to see him thriving in a life that had no space for you. Back in her hotel room, Sarah's shock gave way to rage. She had spent 6 years grieving while he had been building this new reality. 6 years of therapy and support groups and nightmares. 6 years of blaming herself, wondering if she could have prevented the accident somehow. All while he sat in charming cafes and hosted literary readings under a false name. When her fury finally subsided, it left behind a cold clarity. Sarah now understood what she needed to do, not confront him. What would that accomplish except to disrupt the careful fiction he had created? No, she would document everything, gather evidence, and then decide whether to shatter his new life or let him continue living his lie. The next morning, Sarah returned to the neighborhood with her phone camera ready. She photographed Thomas entering his building, Thomas at the cafe, Thomas walking to the bookstore. She followed at a careful distance, noting his routines and interactions. She learned that the woman from the cafe appeared to be more colleague than romantic partner, as they parted ways with professional cordiality rather than intimacy. That evening, Sarah attended the reading at the bookstore, sitting at the back with sunglasses on despite the dimly lit interior. She listened as the man she had married delivered an impassioned analysis of Gabriel Garcia Marquez's treatment of time and memory. His Spanish was flawless now, something he had only begun studying in the year before his death. His mannerisms were the same, though. The way he used his hands when emphasizing important points, the slight frown when concentrating on a passage. After the reading, as attendees mingled with wine and conversation, Sarah slipped out. She had heard enough, seen enough. Thomas, no, Juan now, was flourishing in this fabricated life. She returned to her hotel and booked an earlier return flight. 3 days in Santiago had given her all the confirmation she needed. On the flight home, Sarah sorted through the evidence she had collected. Photos, recordings of the reading, notes on Juan Navarro's established history in Chile. She also examined what she knew of Thomas's final months before the accident, the insurance policy, the missing first editions, the conference in Argentina that she now suspected had been reconnaissance for his new life. The pieces fit together with terrifying precision. By the time her plane landed, Sarah had reached a decision. She would not expose him, not yet. First, she needed to understand why. What had driven Thomas to such an extreme? What had been so unbearable about their life together that he had chosen to die rather than continue it? Back home, Sarah returned to the box of inconsistencies with new purpose. She reviewed bank statements, emails, phone records from the months leading up to Thomas's disappearance. A pattern emerged that she hadn't seen before. Large withdrawals followed by periods of unusual attentiveness, as if compensating for something. Calls to numbers she didn't recognize, always from his office phone rather than his cell. And a recurring name in his email correspondence, Elena Navarro. The surname couldn't be coincidence. Sarah spent weeks piecing together Thomas's transformation into Juan. Elena appeared to be a distant relative of Thomas's maternal grandmother, a connection so remote that Sarah had never heard her mentioned. But Thomas had apparently reached out to her 2 years before his disappearance, initially with questions about family history. Those inquiries had evolved into discussions about Chilean citizenship through ancestry, academic positions in Santiago, and eventually logistics. Elena had helped create Juan Navarro long before Thomas Harlow drove his car into the ravine. The pieces were falling into place, but the central question remained. Why? Sarah found herself returning to their final year together, re-examining every conversation, every silence, searching for clues she had missed. Thomas had been more distant, yes, working longer hours and traveling more frequently for conferences, but there had been no major conflicts, no betrayals she was aware of, no traumatic event that might have triggered such a drastic escape. Unless... Sarah remembered Thomas's increasing discomfort with his role at the university. The politics of academia had been wearing on him. His department was shifting focus toward more contemporary literature and digital humanities, moving away from the classics that were Thomas's passion. He had been passed over for department chair despite his qualifications. But was professional dissatisfaction enough to abandon his entire life? To abandon her? There had been other tensions too, subtle pressures from both families about when they would have children. Sarah had been ambivalent, and Thomas had never pushed, but she wondered now if he had harbored stronger feelings on the subject than he'd expressed. Still, these everyday stresses didn't explain such an extreme action. Sarah kept digging, reviewing their joint email account which she had maintained all these years, paying the annual fee automatically. In the archived folders, she found a subfolder she didn't recognize, labeled simply M. Inside were dozens of emails between Thomas and someone whose address was just a string of numbers and letters. The messages were cryptic, often referring to books and literary passages in ways that seemed to be code. It took Sarah weeks to decipher the pattern, but eventually she understood. M wasn't a person but a project, a manuscript. Thomas had been working on a novel secretly, one that explored themes of identity, escape, and reinvention. The emails were to a literary agent who specialized in works published under pseudonyms. Thomas had been planning not just a physical escape, but a creative rebirth as well. 7 months after her discovery of Juan Navarro, Sarah received a package from a bookstore in Madrid. Inside was a newly published novel by Juan Navarro titled The Staged Exit. She hadn't ordered it. There was no note, no indication of who had sent it. But as she began reading, Sarah recognized fragments of their life together transformed into fiction. The protagonist was a woman who faked her death to escape an overwhelming sense of living someone else's expectations, the inverse of Thomas's own escape. The dedication page read simply, "For S. I'm sorry it had to be this way." Sarah read the novel in one sitting, tears streaming down her face as she recognized the coded explanation Thomas had crafted for her. Through fiction, he was telling her what he couldn't say directly, that he had felt trapped not by her specifically, but by the life they had built together, by expectations he had initially embraced, but later found suffocating, that he had loved her, but couldn't be the person she needed, that he had chosen this cruel kindness of a clean break rather than a messy, painful unraveling. In the novel's final chapter, the protagonist leaves subtle clues for her husband, hoping he will understand that her death was a choice rather than a tragedy. She creates a new identity in a distant city, but finds herself haunted by guilt, sending anonymous messages that he never recognizes as coming from her. The novel ends ambiguously, with the possibility of eventual revelation hanging in the air. Sarah understood the message. Thomas was reaching out in his way, acknowledging what he had done without risking his carefully constructed new reality. The package had been sent from Madrid, not Chile, another layer of distance and deniability. There would be no direct confrontation, no dramatic reunion. Just this, a fictional confession nested within a real deception. 2 weeks later, Sarah set up an anonymous email account and sent a message to Juan Navarro's public email address at the University of Santiago. It contained just one line: "I received your novel. I understand now, it doesn't make it right." No response came, but Sarah hadn't really expected one. What could he possibly say after all this time? She had the answers she had sought in Santiago, though they weren't the ones she had hoped for. Thomas hadn't been kidnapped or suffering from amnesia or forced to disappear by mysterious threats. He had simply chosen to leave, to end one life and begin another. The 7th anniversary of Thomas's death arrived, and for the first time Sarah didn't mark the occasion. Instead, she began clearing out his office, donating his remaining books to the university library. She removed his clothes from the back of the closet, his toiletries from the bathroom cabinet. She wasn't erasing him, that would never be possible, but she was acknowledging the truth. Thomas Harlow had chosen to die. The grief she had carried for 6 years had been real, even if the death had not been. As summer approached, Sarah submitted her resignation to the school. She had been offered a position teaching English literature at a small college in Oregon, about as far from her current life as she could get without leaving the country altogether. Perhaps Thomas had been right about one thing. Sometimes the only way forward is to leave everything behind. Before leaving, Sarah had one last task. She carefully packed the box of evidence she had collected about Juan Navarro and Thomas's transformation. She added printed copies of their correspondence, bank records showing the methodical withdrawal of funds, and photos from her trip to Santiago. On top, she placed a copy of The Staged Exit and a brief note: "I won't be the one to expose you. That choice remains yours, as it always has been." She addressed the package to Elena Navarro in Santiago with no return address. Whether Elena would share it with Thomas or simply destroy it, Sarah would never know. It didn't matter. What mattered was that Sarah was finally setting down the weight she had carried for so long. The night before her departure for Oregon, Sarah stood in the empty house that had once been theirs. The furniture remained staged for showing to potential buyers, but all personal items had been packed or discarded. The walls that had witnessed their happiness and Thomas's secret planning and Sarah's years of grief now stood blank, waiting for new stories to unfold within them. Sarah walked through each room, allowing memories to surface and then letting them go. In Thomas's office, empty now except for the built-in bookshelves, she paused longest. This was where he had plotted his escape, where he had crafted Juan Navarro while Thomas Harlow still drew breath. This was where he had decided that their life together was something he could leave behind. As she turned to leave the room, Sarah noticed something in the corner of the highest bookshelf, a small, folded piece of paper wedged into a seam in the wood. She brought a chair over and carefully extracted it. Inside was a handwritten note in Thomas's distinctive script. "If you're reading this, you've either found me out or are finally letting go. Either way, I hope you can forgive what I couldn't say to your face. The man you married disappeared long before the car went over that ravine. I became a character in my own life. Professor, husband, colleague, playing parts that grew more suffocating with each passing year. You deserved someone who wasn't acting. I'm sorry for the pain I've caused. I'm not asking for understanding. Just know that the happiest moments of Thomas Harlow's life were with you, even if those moments weren't enough to save him." Sarah carefully folded the note and placed it in her pocket. Outside, the moving truck had arrived to collect the few boxes she was taking to her new life. She took one last look around the empty house before locking the door and placing the key in the realtor's lockbox. As she drove away, Sarah thought about the note. It wasn't an adequate explanation, nothing could be, but it was the closest to closure she would ever get. Thomas had written it before his staged death, anticipating that she might one day discover the truth. He had known her well enough to predict she would eventually put the pieces together, just not well enough to trust her with his truth while he still lived as her husband. Oregon welcomed Sarah with misty mountains and the scent of pine. Her small faculty apartment overlooked a lake, nothing like the suburban street she had left behind. On her first night there, she unpacked Thomas's note and placed it in a small wooden box along with her wedding ring. Then she set the box on the highest shelf of her new bookcase, not forgotten, but no longer central to her daily life. 6 months into her new position, Sarah received an email notification about a new publication by Juan Navarro, a collection of essays on literary deception and authorial identity. She started to order it, then stopped herself. She was no longer collecting evidence or seeking understanding. Thomas Juan had made his choice years ago. Now she was making hers. That weekend, Sarah accepted a dinner invitation from a colleague in the history department. They talked about books and teaching and hiking trails in the mountains. Not once did she mention Thomas or Juan or Chile or staged deaths. When her colleague walked her to her door and asked if they might do this again sometime, Sarah smiled and said yes. It wasn't a betrayal or even really a new beginning. It was simply life continuing. Across the ocean, in a bookstore in Santiago, Juan Navarro signed copies of his latest work. If he sometimes paused to examine the faces in the crowd, or if his eyes lingered on women with honey-colored hair like Sarah's, no one seemed to notice. He had become adept at hiding such moments, just as he had become adept at being Juan rather than Thomas. At night, alone in his apartment, he sometimes searched for news of Sarah online, tracing her move to Oregon and her new position. He never reached out directly, never tried to explain beyond what he had written in his novel and that final note hidden in the bookshelf. What would be the point? It was too late for reconciliation, too late for proper goodbyes, too late for anything but this strange, distant awareness of parallel lives that had once been entwined. In Oregon, Sarah gradually built a new community. She joined a hiking club, volunteered at the local library, developed courses that reflected her own literary interests rather than following prescribed curricula. She dated occasionally, but made no promises. She was learning to trust her instincts again, to recognize when something felt wrong, even if she couldn't immediately articulate why. 2 years after moving to Oregon, Sarah published an academic paper on unreliable narrators and literary disappearances. She didn't reference Thomas directly, but his influence was there between the lines for anyone who knew to look. The paper was well received, leading to speaking invitations and consideration for early tenure. During this time, Sarah maintained the email address she had used to contact Juan just that once. She never wrote again, but occasionally she would check it, a habit she couldn't quite break. Usually the inbox was empty, except for spam. But on the 9th anniversary of Thomas's accident, a message appeared. It was brief. "I saw your paper. Brilliant analysis. You always saw more clearly than I gave you credit for. I hope Oregon is treating you well." Sarah stared at the screen, her hand hovering over the keyboard. She could respond, she could demand more answers, express her lingering anger, seek more complete closure. She could tell him about her new life, her growing success, her gradual healing. Instead, she closed the laptop without replying. Some correspondence didn't need to be continued. Some chapters were better left closed, even if the endings weren't the ones we would have written ourselves. In her new office at the college, Sarah kept no photographs of Thomas, no visible reminders of her previous life. But in her home, in a drawer of her desk, she kept the wooden box with his final note and her wedding ring. Not because she couldn't let go, but because she had learned that letting go didn't have to mean forgetting. The past was part of her story, even the painful chapters, even the lies and deceptions. Occasionally, Sarah would find herself thinking about Thomas in quiet moments, wondering if he was truly happy as Juan, if he ever regretted his choice, if he thought about her as often as she had once thought about him. But these wonderings came with less pain now, less urgency. They were questions without answers, and she was learning to live with that ambiguity. 10 years after Thomas drove his car into the ravine, Sarah received a package from Chile. Inside was a newspaper clipping announcing the death of Juan Navarro, a heart attack at his desk in the university library. There was no note accompanying the clipping, but Sarah recognized Elena's handwriting on the address label. Thomas was truly gone now. The fiction he had created had ended, just as the life they had shared had ended a decade earlier. Sarah placed the clipping in the wooden box alongside his note and her ring. Then she called her current partner, a kind botanist who knew fragments of her story, but never pressed for more than she was willing to share. "Are you okay?" he asked when she told him about the clipping, the final proof that the man she had once loved had lived a full decade beyond his staged death. Sarah considered the question carefully before answering. "Yes," she said finally, "I think I am." And she was surprised to discover it was true. That night, Sarah dreamed of Thomas, not as he had appeared in the bookstore in Santiago, but as he had been when they first met, young and passionate and full of ideas about literature and life. In the dream, they sat across from each other in the university library where their story had begun. "Did you find what you were looking for?" she asked him. Thomas smiled sadly. "Parts of it, not all. And you?" "I'm still looking," Sarah told him. "But I'm enjoying the search more than I used to." When she woke, Sarah felt a sense of peace that had eluded her for years. Thomas had chosen his path. She had found hers. Their stories had diverged and would never reunite, but perhaps that was as it should be. Not all narratives resolve neatly. Not all characters find their way back to each other. Life continued. Seasons changed. Sarah's career flourished. She published a novel of her own under her own name, drawing obliquely on her experience but transforming it into something new. She didn't send a copy to Elena Navarro or try to discover who might have inherited Juan's library of rare first editions. Some stories end, some questions remain unanswered, and sometimes that's enough. When Sarah thought of Thomas now, which was less and less frequently as the years passed, she remembered not the betrayal or the years of grief, but something he had once said during a lecture she had attended early in their relationship. He had been discussing the concept of peripeteia in Greek tragedy, the sudden reversal of fortune that reveals a deeper truth. The moment everything changes, he had told his students, is also the moment when everything becomes clear. We may not like what we see in that clarity, but we cannot unsee it once it appears. Sarah had experienced her own peripeteia that April day when her thumb slipped on her phone screen, revealing Thomas alive in a bookstore in Santiago. Everything had changed in that instant, and everything had become clear, though the clarity had taken longer to fully process. She couldn't unsee what she had discovered, couldn't unknow the truth that had replaced her years of grief. But she had survived that reversal, that unmaking and remaking of her understanding. She had built something new from the ruins of what she had believed to be true, and in doing so, Perhaps she had discovered something Thomas never had, that sometimes the most courageous choice isn't to escape, but to remain, to face the complexities and disappointments of the life you have, rather than vanishing into a life you've invented. In the end, Sarah kept the wooden box with its mementos, but she moved it from her desk drawer to the attic of the home she now shared with her botanist. Not discarded, but archived, a chapter of her life that had closed, but still informed who she had become. And sometimes, on rainy October nights when the wind rushed through the pines outside her window, Sarah would think of a car tumbling down a ravine, of a man walking away from the staged wreckage of one life toward the carefully planned beginning of another. She would wonder what might have been different if Thomas had found the courage to speak his truth rather than craft his elaborate fiction. But those wonderings grew less frequent with time, replaced by the immediate concerns and joys of her present life. The past receded, as it always does, becoming a story she had lived through rather than a wound that defined her. In Santiago, the bookstore where Sarah had first glimpsed Juan Navarro continued under new management. The rare first editions that had once belonged to Thomas Harlow were sold at auction, scattered to collectors around the world. The apartment where he had lived his second life was rented to a young professor of literature who never knew its previous tenant, and in a small college town in Oregon, Sarah continued to teach her students about unreliable narrators and literary disappearances, about characters who reinvent themselves and the readers who believe in them until the moment of revelation. Sometimes she thought she saw a flicker of recognition in a student's eyes, as if they sensed there was more to these lectures than academic theory, but she never confirmed their suspicions. Some stories are better left as mysteries, their truths hidden between the lines for those who know how to read them. It was late and the scotch bottle was nearly empty. Sarah had been grading papers all evening, but her attention had wandered to the small wooden box she'd retrieved from the attic earlier that day, the 10th anniversary of discovering Thomas alive in that bookstore in Santiago, the anniversary of her second life beginning in a way. Sarah opened the box and touched each item gently. The wedding ring, Thomas's final note, the newspaper clipping announcing Juan's death, these tangible remnants of a life unraveled and reconstructed. She had stopped asking why years ago. The why no longer mattered as much as what had come after. Her phone chimed with a message from her botanist, now her husband of 2 years, saying he'd be home late from his research trip, but was thinking of her. Sarah smiled and typed a quick response. Real happiness, she had discovered, often came quietly, without the dramatic intensity that had characterized her relationship with Thomas. As she replaced the items in the box, Sarah noticed something she hadn't seen before, a small tear in the velvet lining at the bottom. Curious, she gently pulled at the fabric, revealing another folded piece of paper hidden beneath. Her heart raced as she carefully extracted it. The handwriting was Elena's, not Thomas's. The note was dated just after Juan Navarro's death. Sarah, he asked me to send you this if anything happened to him. He wanted you to know that creating Juan wasn't just about escape. It was about becoming who he believed he was meant to be. In his final months, he spoke often of writing to you directly, of explaining everything properly. Time ran out before courage arrived, but he kept every article you published, every mention of your name in academic journals. The man who left you never stopped watching from a distance. Perhaps that offers some comfort. Perhaps it only deepens the wound. Either way, it is the truth. Elena. Sarah sat motionless, the note trembling slightly in her hand. After all these years, one more piece of the puzzle, though not the one she might have expected. Not an apology or explanation, but confirmation that Thomas had carried her with him into his new life, just as she had carried him. She returned Elena's note to the box alongside the others. Then she closed the lid firmly and returned to her papers. Tomorrow she would put the box back in the attic, perhaps for the last time. The story of Thomas and Juan and Sarah had no tidy resolution, no moment when everything made perfect sense, just fragments of truth and lingering questions, and the peace that comes with acceptance. Life rarely offers complete closure, only the choice to keep moving forward, carrying our past with us but not defined by it. Sarah finished grading the last paper and turned out the light. Outside, rain began to fall. A gentle Oregon rain, nothing like the torrential downpour that had presumably washed away Thomas Harlow's body all those years ago. She listened to its rhythm on the roof, a sound that had once triggered painful memories, but now simply marked the passage of time, the changing of seasons. In the morning, her students would discuss the concept of anagnorisis, the moment of recognition or discovery that follows peripeteia in classical tragedy. Sarah would guide them through examples from literature without mentioning her own moment of recognition in that classroom years ago, staring at an Instagram photo of a bookstore in Santiago. Some lessons are best taught without revealing their personal foundations. The house creaked and settled around her as Sarah prepared for bed. These familiar sounds had replaced the phantom footsteps she once thought she heard in the home she'd shared with Thomas. This place was truly hers, her choice, her creation, untainted by deception. As she drifted towards sleep, Sarah thought about the latest batch of student papers she'd been grading. The assignment had asked them to analyze a character who undergoes a profound transformation. Several had chosen characters who fake their own deaths as a means of reinvention. Sarah had smiled at the irony as she read their analyses, none aware of how personally their professor understood such narratives. In her dreams that night, Sarah stood not in the bookstore in Santiago, but on the edge of the ravine where Thomas's car had gone over. In this dream, unlike the one years before, she wasn't watching him disappear into the darkness. Instead, she was the one looking over the edge, considering the plunge not into death but into radical reinvention. Behind her, Thomas watched silently, neither encouraging nor preventing her choice. Sarah woke before dawn, the dream still vivid. She understood its message without needing to analyze it. We all stand at the edge of our own ravines at various points in our lives, contemplating versions of ourselves that might exist if we were brave enough or desperate enough to leap. Thomas had jumped. Sarah had chosen a different path, slower perhaps, but no less transformative in the end. By the time her husband returned from his research trip the following evening, the wooden box was back in the attic, and Sarah had submitted a proposal for a book combining literary analysis with memoir, exploring the concept of identity transformation through both fictional narratives and personal experience. It would be her most revelatory work to date, though still maintaining certain veils over the most private aspects of her story. "You seem different," her husband said as they prepared dinner together. "Something happened while I was away." Sarah considered the question, knife pausing above the vegetables she was chopping. "Just made a decision I've been putting off," she said finally, "about how much of myself to put into my work." He nodded, respecting, as always, her tendency toward brief explanations when it came to certain topics. This was one of the things she loved most about him. His patience, his understanding that some stories unfold slowly or remain partially told. That night, as they sat on their porch watching stars appear above the pines, Sarah found herself telling him more about Thomas than she ever had before. Not everything. Some details remained hers alone, but enough that the outline of the story became clearer. The staged death, the discovery years later, the complex emotions that had followed. "What would you have done?" she asked him when she'd finished. "If you'd found him in that bookstore, would you have confronted him?" Her husband considered the question carefully, the way he considered all important matters. "I'd like to think I would have had the courage to face him," he said finally, "but I honestly don't know. What about you? Do you ever regret not speaking to him directly when you had the chance?" Sarah watched the stars, thinking about the bookstore, the cafe, the reading where she'd sat in the back with sunglasses on, listening to the voice she'd once loved explain magical realism to strangers. "I regretted it for years," she admitted, "but now I think it was the right choice. We'd both moved too far into our new lives by then. A confrontation would have been performative, more for my benefit than leading to any real understanding." They sat in comfortable silence until the night grew cool. As they went inside, Sarah realized she felt lighter, as if sharing even this partial version of her story had released something she'd been carrying too long alone. In the months that followed, Sarah's book proposal was accepted by a university press. She wrote steadily, weaving together literary analysis and carefully curated personal narrative. She didn't name Thomas or detail his transformation into Juan, but she explored the psychological mechanisms of identity reinvention through both fictional examples and unnamed personal experience. The writing process became its own form of closure, not erasing the past but integrating it, transforming private pain into public insight. Sarah found herself drawing connections she hadn't consciously recognized before, seeing patterns in Thomas's behavior that had been invisible while she was still immersed in grief and betrayal. When the book was published the following year, It received modest but appreciative attention in academic circles. At a small launch event at her college, one of her senior colleagues mentioned how the personal elements brought theoretical concepts to life in unexpected ways. "You write as if you've stood on both sides of transformation," the colleague observed, "as both the person changing and the person witnessing change." Sarah smiled, remembering her dream at the ravine's edge. "I suppose in some ways I have," she replied. Later that evening, alone in her office, Sarah checked the anonymous email account she had maintained all these years, a habit now more ritual than necessity. To her surprise, there was a message from Elena Navarro. "I've read your book." He would have recognized himself in it, I think, though you were careful with specifics. "I'm writing because I found something while finally clearing out his apartment, a manuscript he was working on before his heart failed. It's incomplete, but it seems to be his attempt to tell his side of your story. Would you want to see it? I understand if you wouldn't." Sarah stared at the screen, her finger hovering over the keyboard. After all this time, Thomas's version, his explanations, his justifications, his perspective on what had happened between them and after. Part of her was intensely curious. Another part recoiled at the thought of reopening what had finally begun to heal. In the end, she replied simply, "Thank you for the offer. I think our stories have diverged too much at this point. His version belongs to him, as mine belongs to me." Elena's response came quickly. "I understand. I'll keep it safe in case you ever change your mind." Sarah closed her laptop, oddly at peace with her decision. Some questions were better left unanswered, some mysteries preserved rather than solved. Thomas had made his choices, and she had made hers. Their paths had intersected and then separated, as paths do. 15 years after Thomas Harlow drove his car into a ravine on a rainy October night, Sarah received tenure at her college and celebrated by taking a sabbatical. She and her husband traveled for several months, visiting places she had always wanted to see, but had never managed to during her marriage to Thomas. In Barcelona, on a warm spring afternoon, Sarah was browsing in a small bookshop when she noticed a familiar name on a shelf of translated works, Juan Navarro. It was his novel, The Staged Exit, now translated into Spanish. She hadn't looked at it in years, having left her copy in the wooden box in the attic. On impulse, Sarah purchased the book. That evening, sitting on the balcony of their rented apartment overlooking the city, she began reading it again. The words were familiar yet different, viewed now through the lens of years and experience rather than raw hurt. "What's that?" her husband asked, joining her with glasses of local wine. "A ghost story," Sarah replied, "but not the kind with specters or haunted houses." He nodded, understanding in his way that this was another piece of her past she was processing. "Is it good?" he asked simply. Sarah considered the question as she closed the book, marking her place. "It's honest in its dishonesty," she said finally, "which I suppose is the best some people can manage." They watched the sunset over Barcelona, and Sarah found herself thinking not about Thomas or Juan, but about the woman she had become through it all. Someone stronger than she might have been without the fracture and rebuilding. Someone more compassionate toward human frailty, more accepting of imperfection. The next morning, Sarah left the Spanish translation of The Staged Exit on a bench in Park Güell for someone else to find. She didn't need it anymore. Neither the story Thomas had crafted, nor the coded explanation it contained. She had written her own story now, one that acknowledged his influence without being defined by it. Back in Oregon after their travels, Sarah resumed teaching with renewed energy. Her book had become part of the curriculum in several universities' literature programs, and occasionally she received emails from students or fellow academics interested in her perspective on literary disappearances and identity transformations. She responded to these inquiries thoughtfully, but always maintained certain boundaries around her personal connection to the material. Some experiences were meant for sharing. Others remained private, not secret, but sacred in their way. 20 years after Thomas's staged death, Sarah received an unexpected package. Inside was a first edition of The Odyssey, the same edition that had been part of Thomas's collection, the one she had noticed missing after his disappearance. A small card accompanied it. "Found among my Aunt Elena's possessions after her passing. She left instructions that this should be returned to you. M. Navarro." Sarah ran her fingers over the leather binding, remembering how Thomas had treasured this volume. He must have taken it with him when he left, one of the few tangible connections to his former life, and now it had completed its own odyssey, returning to her after all these years. She placed the book not in the attic box but on her office shelf, a visible reminder of the circular nature of certain stories. Not everything that leaves stays gone forever. Not every departure is permanent. Sarah continued to build her life, teaching, writing, traveling with her husband, deepening friendships, mentoring students. The story of Thomas and Juan receded further into her past, though it never disappeared entirely. How could it? It had shaped her in ways both obvious and subtle, influencing choices she made and paths she followed long after the immediate pain had faded. Occasionally, Sarah would receive messages from an unfamiliar email address, brief comments about her published work, or links to literary articles that might interest her. She suspected these came from Elena before her death, perhaps at Thomas's posthumous request. She never responded, but felt a strange comfort in these periodic connections, these echoes from a life once entwined with hers. 30 years after that rainy October night, Sarah stood at the front of a lecture hall, delivering her final class before retirement. The subject was, fittingly, literary transformations and disappearances. As students took notes and asked questions, Sarah found herself thinking about the long arc of her career and the personal experience that had unknowingly set its direction. The most compelling stories, she told her students as the class ended, are those where transformation occurs not through supernatural means, but through human choice. Sometimes brave, sometimes cowardly, always complex. We reinvent ourselves daily in small ways. Some people just take more dramatic approaches than others. A student raised her hand. Professor, in your book you talk about understanding both sides of transformation, the person who changes and the person left behind. Do you think one role is harder than the other? Sarah considered the question carefully. They're difficult in different ways, she said finally. The person who chooses transformation carries the burden of decision and its consequences. The person left behind carries the burden of making meaning from what remains. Neither role is easier, just different. After the students had filed out, Sarah remained in the empty lecture hall, thinking about the journey that had brought her here. From the young woman who had fallen in love with a literature professor to the retiring academic who had built a career partly from the ashes of his deception. That evening at her retirement party, colleagues shared stories and presented gifts. Sarah smiled and thanked them, genuinely moved by their affection and respect. When asked what she planned to do next, she spoke of travel plans and a new book project, but privately she was most looking forward to the space to reflect, to integrate all the chapters of her life into a coherent whole. Later that night, alone in her study while her husband slept, Sarah opened her laptop and navigated to the anonymous email account she still maintained after all these years. She composed a new message, addressing it to the account that had occasionally sent her literary links and comments. I'm retiring this week. 30 years of teaching, writing, and learning. I've never properly thanked you for the inadvertent push onto this path. Without the fracture you caused, I might never have discovered my own voice so completely. I'm not saying what you did was right. It wasn't. But I've built something meaningful from it. I hope you did too in whatever time you had. This will be my last message to this address. Goodbye, Thomas. Sarah sent the email, then permanently deleted the account. It was time to close even this tenuous connection to the past. Not out of bitterness or lingering hurt, but simply because its purpose had been fulfilled. Some stories need endings, even if they're endings we write ourselves. In the years that followed her retirement, Sarah finished her final book, a memoir that for the first time told her story without veils or literary disguises. She changed names and specific identifying details out of respect for privacy, but the emotional truth was there in full. The love, the loss, the deception, the discovery, the rebuilding. When the memoir was published, it received wider attention than her academic works had, touching readers who recognized in her experience echoes of their own losses and reinventions. Sarah gave a few carefully selected interviews, but declined most publicity opportunities. The story was out in the world now, but she had no desire to become its public face. At a small bookstore event near her home, a woman approached Sarah after her reading. She was perhaps in her 30s, with dark eyes that seemed familiar somehow. My name is Marta Navarro, she said quietly. Elena was my aunt. My father was Juan's, Thomas's, cousin in Chile. I grew up hearing stories about him after he came to Santiago. I just wanted to meet you." Sarah felt a momentary vertigo, as if time had folded in on itself. "Did you know him well?" she asked when she could speak. Marta shook her head. "I was young when he died, but I remember him always being kind to me, always bringing me books. And I remember how sad he seemed sometimes, especially when he thought no one was watching." They talked for nearly an hour, sharing pieces of a man they had both known in different contexts, different identities. Marta had brought photographs: Juan in his office at the university, Juan at family gatherings, Juan standing in front of La Biblioteca Secreta. "Would you like copies?" Marta offered. "I thought you might want to see this part of his life." Sarah considered the offer, studying the images of the man who had once been her husband, now older, bearded, surrounded by people she had never met in a life she had never shared. "Thank you," she said finally, "but I think it's better if he remains as I remember him, and as you remember him. Two different men, in a way." Marta nodded, understanding. "He kept a photo of you, you know, in his desk drawer at home. My aunt found it after he died. It was from your wedding day, though the glass was cracked." Sarah smiled at the symmetry, the same photo she had kept on her nightstand all those years. "We all keep pieces of our past," she said, "even when we try to leave it behind." They parted with an embrace that bridged worlds. Thomas's first life and his second, connected briefly through these two women who had loved him in different ways. When Sarah arrived home that evening, she told her husband about the encounter. He listened attentively, asking thoughtful questions about how she felt. Seeing this connection to her past appear so unexpectedly, it felt like the final piece somehow, Sarah said. "Not of understanding why he left, I don't think I'll ever fully understand that, but of accepting that his life continued, that he built something real, even if it was founded on deception." That night, Sarah dreamed of parallel lives. Not just hers and Thomas's, but countless variations that might have unfolded had different choices been made at crucial moments. In some, Thomas had found the courage to tell her his truth instead of staging his death. In others, she had confronted him in that bookstore in Santiago. In still others, they had never met at all. She woke with a profound sense of peace, of acceptance that out of all those possible paths, the one she had walked had led her here, to a life of meaning and connection, of work that mattered and relationships that sustained, not despite Thomas's deception, but in some strange way because of it, because of how it had forced her to rebuild herself from her foundation. 40 years after that rainy night when Thomas Harlow had supposedly died, Sarah stood at the edge of the ravine where his car had gone over. She had never visited the actual site before, though she had passed near it many times over the years. The road had been improved since then, with guardrails now protecting the sharp curve. Sarah's husband waited in the car, understanding her need to do this alone. She stood silent, looking down at the drop that had supposedly claimed Thomas's life, but had instead been the launching point for his transformation into Juan, the place where her life had split into before and after, though she hadn't known it at the time. The wind rustled through trees that had grown taller in the decades since that night. Sarah took a deep breath, feeling the weight of years and choices, of grief and discovery, of endings and beginnings. Then she took from her pocket the wedding ring she had kept all this time in the wooden box. She looked at it one last time, before drawing back her arm and throwing it into the ravine, not in anger or bitterness, but as a final release. A recognition that some stories, no matter how complex or painful, eventually find their conclusion, not in dramatic confrontations or perfect understanding, but in quiet moments of letting go. As Sarah turned to walk back to the car, to her husband, to the life she had built from the ruins of deception, she felt Thomas's presence not as a ghost or memory, but as an echo, a ripple that had long ago set her on an unexpected path. She didn't regret that path now, though she would never call his deception a gift. It had simply been what happened, what she had survived and transcended. In the car, her husband took her hand. "Ready?" he asked simply. Sarah nodded, looking ahead through the windshield rather than back at the ravine. "Ready?" she confirmed. As they drove away, Sarah thought about the memoir she had written, about the students she had taught, about the life she had built, layer by careful layer, after the foundation had been shattered. She thought about Thomas in his tweed jacket and wire-rimmed glasses, and Juan with his beard and scholarly demeanor, two versions of the same man who had shaped her story without defining it. "Era tarde demais para perguntas," Era tarde demais para ressentimentos. Era tarde demais para qualquer coisa além de reconhecer que a história deles, complexa, dolorosa e transformadora, tinha finalmente encontrado seu fim. It was too late for questions, too late for resentment, too late for anything but acknowledging that their story, complex, painful, and transformative, had finally found its end. And in that ending, Sarah found not the closure she had once desperately sought, but something more valuable, the understanding that her life had always been her own to shape, even when others' choices had forced unexpected turns. She had transformed tragedy into growth, betrayal into wisdom, abandonment into independence. The car crested a hill, and the road stretched before them, leading away from the ravine and toward home. Sarah felt the weight of 40 years of questions and discoveries settle into a quiet certainty. Whatever came next would be entirely her own story to write. She was no longer the woman Thomas Harlow had left behind. She was no longer defined by his absence or the revelation of his deception. She was simply Sarah, professor, writer, wife, friend, moving forward on a path of her own choosing. The rain began to fall gently as they drove, washing away the last traces of dust from the past.